Since the New Deal in the 1930s, the government has been taking on more policy responsibilities. As the responsibilities of government grew, the size of the government expanded to deliver all of the new programs. Bureaucrats have expertise in delivering programs, which is why Congress prefers to delegate responsibility for specific programs to bureaucrats. Sure, Congress could do all the work, but that would take members of Congress away from other things they would prefer to work on, so delegation becomes a rational solution. The Constitution gives Congress the responsibility for creating bureaucratic agencies, so that means that bureaucracies are created on political grounds rather than policy grounds. For example, while Congress may prefer to delegate responsibility, they also want to create a bureaucratic structure that allows them to intervene quickly to solve problems because that can help them in their election campaigns. This is an example of what we talked about earlier in terms of casework. Members of Congress help solve problems that develop. Presidents have a different perspective. They're usually more interested in governing than Congress, so presidents often prefer to have agencies located in the White House so that they can exercise more influence. And presidents prefer having these agencies in the White House as opposed to having regulatory agencies, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because it allows the White House to dictate policy much more than independent regulatory agencies. Besides the preferences of each of the actors, there's an underlying issue. What happens if we lose power in the future? i.e. the majority party. What happens if they lose power? Could this bureaucratic agency be used against their interests? This leads to structural decisions based on politics rather than technical considerations, and the need for compromise between the legislative and executive branches often means new agencies are doomed to failure. James Q. Wilson addressed the question of bureaucracies by returning to first principles. What's a purpose? In short, why create this agency or program? Criticizing the bureaucracy is easy, but in Wilson's mind it's a lazy perspective because it allows decision makers to avoid hard questions about the goals of a particular program. One of the major challenges is that bureaucratic agencies are rarely created following detailed discussions and instead are created to respond to some type of problem. On paper, bureaucracies seem harmless, but they have access to information other decision makers need because bureaucrats have expertise and the bureaucrats do not face the voters. So one of the major challenges is getting bureaucracies to reveal this information. Congress, for example, can try to obtain this information in advance. They hold hearings for executive branch appointments, they impose procedural controls, they provide protections for whistleblowers who are people who expose wrongdoing. More common, however, is that the legislative and executive branches respond after the fact and agencies are punished through losing resources or other types of structural reforms. While an easy target, don't underestimate bureaucratic actors. They are rational as are members of Congress and the President, so agencies work to build relationships with groups and politicians who can provide needed political support. Smart bureaucrats share information and respond to informal suggestions and other legislative mandates. During the earliest years of the Republic, the size of the bureaucracy was rather small because the national government provided a very limited set of services. In fact, there were more members of Congress than civil servants at one brief point in our nation's history. As the size of government increased modestly, the expectations for who should serve in government also changed. The democratic spirit that flourished in the 1820s with the rise of Andrew Jackson changed expectation. Jackson believed that any man could serve in government, although Jackson preferred individuals serve for a fixed period of time and then move to another position. By the late 1820s and early 1830s, Jackson's preferences gave way to political expediency, as both parties realized that government jobs were a good way to reward those who had helped with the political campaign. The spoils system involved parties using positions in government as carrots to reward those who had worked hard, and the customs houses and post offices were popular agencies to reward supporters. These jobs are called patronage. Supporters got jobs based on not on what they knew or what they could do, but on who they knew in the winning party. Moving people in and out of government is one of the reasons for all the rules and regulations that exist. And these processes were established so there would be a paper trail and individuals could be slotted in and given a defined set of responsibilities. Those who received these patronage positions were often expected to return anywhere between 1% and 6% of their salaries to the party. Think of it as a tax. Scandals in the 19th century and the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 provided the spark for change. The Pendleton Act required job seekers be hired following competitive exams where they would need to demonstrate their skills. It also made it illegal for individuals to pay dues to political parties in exchange for positions in government. Not having constant turnover allowed bureaucracies to develop expertise in performing their jobs, and this could translate into better public policy since bureaucrats would have a great deal of information. The initial reach of the Pendleton Act was small, but civil service protections have been expanded. Today, nearly all positions in the federal government, with the exception of those requiring Senate confirmation and common laborers, are governed under civil service protections. Besides the protections, Congress passed the Hatch Act in 1939 to prevent government employees from engaging in campaign activity. In 1993, that law was loosened to allow federal employees to engage in political activities so long as they are not at work. The adoption of the Pendleton Act arose from political scandals, and progressive reformers wanted to limit the effects of politics. Policies would be made through a political process, but impartial experts in the bureaucracy organized for effective performance would implement the policies. This is kind of contrary to Wilson's arguments. Some agencies gained independence in the late 19th century by demonstrating this type of impartial expertise. The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, in the 1900s focused on the science of seeds, crops, and soils to help farmers become more productive. These initial breakthroughs led to greater agency autonomy because farmers could increase their yields and the aid was not dependent on political affiliation. There is no clear constitutional provision for a cabinet, and Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the President may request reports in writing, but that does not establish the cabinet as a major policy-making body. Today, the President is the decision maker, and the members of his cabinet are expected to serve as the President's voice, and there are no special privileges awarded to the cabinet, although the departments within it probably have a slightly higher prestige, making it easier to compete for resources. The President appoints the leaders of agencies subject to a majority vote in the United States Senate. For example, last year, President Obama nominated Loretta Lynch as the Attorney General of the United States, where she would be responsible for leading the Department of Justice. While serving as secretary sounds appealing, those individuals face conflicting responsibilities. Cabinet secretaries are seen as advocates for their policy domain, champions for workers in their departments, and aggressive seekers of budgetary resources. On the other hand, since they serve at the pleasure of the President, they have an obligation to pursue the President's preferences and serve as the President's point person on a specific line of policy. Each President decides how much latitude the Cabinet Secretaries will have in different areas, and there is often conflict between the White House staff, who want a greater focus on the President's priorities, and bureaucrats who want to focus more specifically on policy. One example during President Obama's first term was allowing the former Attorney General Eric Holder to make decisions about the legal policies concerning enemy combatants held at Guantanamo Bay. Mr. Holder decided to try some of those September 11th suspects in criminal court in New York City. Congressional leaders were unhappy with the decision and threatened legislation requiring military tribunals, and the White House staff was concerned that Mr. Holder was not sufficiently sensitive to President Obama's political interests. Not surprisingly, Mr. Holder eventually backed down on this, and there were no public trials of the September 11th suspects. The agencies in the cabinet fulfill a variety of roles in our political system. Some of the agencies provide for national maintenance because they handle important constitutional roles, such as national defense and diplomacy. These are the Departments of Defense and State, and others collect revenue and handle government bills, Treasury. Ironic on this April 15th, tax deadline day. Some of the agencies serve specific clienteles in American society, such as agriculture, farmers, housing and urban development, those interested in housing policy, and these departments place most of their personnel in field offices working directly with clients and try to lobby Congress on behalf of the needs and interests of their clients. Some major agencies are more prominent than their departments. For example, the Internal Revenue Service is part of the Treasury Department, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation is part of the Justice Department.